Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. So when you look back through the history of cricket's absolute greatest fast bowlers, you usually expect, these crazy stories of terrifying speed, shattered stumps, and just overwhelming physical intimidation. You picture these fiery personalities sprinting to the crease, basically attempting to take the batter's head off, right? But as I was going through the source material, digging into the historical stats and all the player interviews for today's topic, what really stood out to me was a man whose entire career basically defied all that conventional wisdom. We are decoding one of international cricket's most fascinating paradoxes today. We're exploring a player who dominated the globe not with overwhelming physical force, but with a relentless, almost terrifying precision. Today, we are deconstructing the legend of the great Australian fast bowler, Glenn McGrath.
I mean, it sounds like a complete contradiction, doesn't it? Is the greatest fast bowler in cricket history a man who wasn't actually all that fast? Well, this single paradox perfectly defines the legend of a boy from the country town of Narromine, near Dubbo in New South Wales. When you dive into his background, you find this incredible story of a skinny kid playing in the rough bushlands of Australia who eventually rises to become a global sporting icon. And he didn't just succeed at the highest level, he literally rewrote the rulebook on what makes a fast bowler truly lethal. He proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you absolutely do not need to be the fastest man on the pitch to be the most dangerous.
Okay, let's dive straight into this. Here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with the slowest great fast bowler. Then, the anatomy of accuracy, milestones of a master, scholars of the game, legacy, tragedy, and controversy. And finally, we'll wrap up the whole shebang with the 5 pillars of pigeon.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the slowest great fast bowler, defying the speed myth.
To truly appreciate Glenn McGrath, who, by the way, was affectionately nicknamed Pigeon by his teammates because of his spindly legs and slender frame, we really have to understand the era he emerged in, and the expectations that he completely shattered. Think back to the 1990s and early 2000s. The expectation for a world-class fast bowler was express pace, massive reverse swing, and just sheer physical intimidation. You had the terrifying speed and toe-crushing Yorkers of guys like Wasim Akram and Waqar Younis. You had the fierce, unplayable bounce of Curtly Ambrose, or the sheer lightning pace of Alan Donald and Shoaib Akhtar. I mean, these men routinely bowled well over 145 to 150 kilometers per hour. But McGrath's reality, it was entirely different. He operated at around 135 kilometers per hour. Now, in the realm of international fast bowling, that is respectable for sure, but certainly not express. And he didn't rely on massive hooping swing through the air either. Instead, he utilized an absolutely error-free line and length combined with steep extra bounce off the pitch. He didn't blow you away with speed, he simply refused to give you a single inch of scoring room.
And this approach was so frustrating, so unbelievably psychologically draining to face, that his fellow Australian bowling legend Shane Warne famously labeled it the torture technique. When you actually explore how this worked, it becomes super clear that McGrath was an absolute master of mental warfare. He lived in what cricket commentators call the corridor of uncertainty, literally just a few inches on the pitch, right outside the off stump, where the batter is forced to play the ball, but remains totally unsure whether to attack or defend. And McGrath wouldn't just bowl there once, he would bowl there for an entire hour. He wouldn't bowl at the middle stump, because that just gives away easy runs to the leg side. Instead, he targeted that exact spot outside off stump, ball after ball, over after over, maiden after maiden. He slowly built this suffocating, unbearable pressure. The batter would defend, leave, defend, get beaten, and eventually the mental fatigue would just set in. Their spirit would break, they'd fish at a ball they really should have left alone, and boom, they'd make a fatal error. It was just a masterclass in psychological disintegration.
Moving on to Section 2, the anatomy of accuracy. The mechanics of the metronome. Let's really break down the physical and tactical mechanics of his approach.
Now, in researching his tactical approach, you might honestly expect a bowler of his caliber to have incredibly complex, convoluted strategies for every single batter in the world, right? But McGrath kept his tactics fiercely uncomplicated. As his teammate Brett Lee recalled from closed-door team meetings, McGrath's core strategy rarely ever changed, regardless of who was at the crease. It was just a profoundly simple 3-step blueprint. Step 1, possess a good bouncer to keep the batter on their back foot. Step 2, possess a good Yorker to threaten their toes. And Step 3, hit the top of off-stump relentlessly. The genius here wasn't the plan itself. I mean, anyone can write that sequence on a whiteboard. The true genius was the biomechanical perfection required to repeat it thousands upon thousands of times without fatigue. It requires supreme physical discipline to not get bored, to not try fancy variations when things aren't happening immediately, and to just trust that flawless execution of a simple plan will eventually yield a wicket. But you know, there was a really vital physical element to this magic too. Glenn McGrath stands at 195 centimeters. That's 6 feet 6 inches tall. When you combine that immense height with a classical high-arm action and an absolutely perfect upright seam presentation, the physics of his bowling become incredibly difficult to handle. This height allowed McGrath to basically hit the deck hard, extracting sudden, surprising, and really steep bounce from pitches that otherwise seemed completely lifeless to shorter bowlers. So, a ball that a batter judged would arrive comfortably at waist height would suddenly just rear up and crash into their ribs, or hit the splice to the bat, or catch their gloves. It meant that even when world-class batters knew exactly where the ball was going to pitch, they could never fully trust how high it was going to bounce. That unpredictable steepness was basically his ultimate physical weapon.
All right, let's jump into Section 3, Milestones of a Master, a timeline of statistical supremacy. When you apply that level of accuracy and bounce over a long period, the numbers become truly staggering.
The timeline of his 14-year international career shows an incredible era of sustained dominance. He made his Test debut against New Zealand in November 1993 in Perth, and that was after playing only 8 first-class matches. A mere month later, he made his one-day international debut. From that point on, he remained the undisputed tip of the spear for the Australian bowling attack all the way through to his retirement in 2007. He bowed out at the absolute peak of the sport, helping Australia win the 2007 World Cup in the Caribbean. But in all the research, I gotta say, here is perhaps the most mind-blowing milestone of his entire career. Glenn McGrath is the only cricketer in the history of the sport to take a wicket on the absolute last ball he ever bowled in all 3 international formats, Test, ODI, and T20. To sign off every single format of the game by taking a wicket on your final delivery. I mean, that is a script you couldn't even write in Hollywood. Talk about bowing out on your own terms.
And if we want to talk about signature performances that really defined his legacy, we have to look closely at these numbers. 8 wickets for just 38 runs. The setting was the 1997 Ashes series between Australia and England. Before this specific match, at the iconic Lord's Cricket Ground, McGrath was reportedly feeling pretty tense and struggling with his rhythm. So the great Australian fast bowler Dennis Lillee took him aside and basically told him to simply relax, breathe, and stop trying so hard to force the issue. Well, the result of that advice was frankly catastrophic for English cricket. On a gloomy, rain-delayed pitch that offered a bit of assistance to the seamers, McGrath went out and systematically dismantled the English batting lineup. He utilized the famous Lord's slope to absolute perfection, taking key wickets including captain Mike Atherton, Mark Butcher, and Nasser Hussain. He left England completely reeling at 13 runs for 3 wickets early on, and ultimately finished the innings with 8 wickets for just 38 runs. He completely turned the historical home of cricket into his own personal playground.
This devastating consistency translated across every single format of the game too. The sheer statistical supremacy is just hard to overstate. In Test match cricket, he made 124 appearances, yielding a massive 563 wickets at an astonishing average of 21.64. I mean, to average under 22 runs per wicket over a 14-year career in modern cricket is almost unthinkable. In one-day internationals, he played 250 matches, taking 381 wickets at a practically identical average of 22.02. And in the ultimate clutch environment, the pressure cooker of the ICC World Cup, he was unparalleled. He won 3 consecutive World Cup titles with Australia in 1999, 2003, and 2007, and he took 71 total World Cup wickets, a record that stood as the absolute benchmark for years. He wasn't just a great bowler. He was the incredibly reliable, thumping engine of an all-conquering Australian dynasty. Section 4. Scholars of the Game. Validation from cricket's giants. Because, stats only ever tell half the story. To truly grasp his greatness, we have to look at the immense respect he commanded from his peers.
In studying this era, it's totally fascinating to look at the dynamic between McGrath and his own teammate, fellow fast-bowling legend Brett Lee. They represented completely polar opposite styles operating in tandem. Lee was the fire, steaming in with express 150-km/h thunderbolts, actively trying to blast batters away. McGrath was the ice. And Lee himself recognized that McGrath's genius lay in that unwavering, icy repetition. Lee famously called him the human metronome, who could land the ball on a 20-cent piece day in, day out. You can only imagine the demoralizing effect on an opposing team when they had to somehow survive the terrifying pace of Brett Lee at one end, only to face the suffocating, flawless accuracy of Glenn McGrath at the other end, knowing the man simply will not bowl a bad ball to relieve the pressure.
But the ultimate validation, however, comes directly from the batters who actually had the miserable task of facing him. The legendary Sachin Tendulkar, universally regarded as arguably the greatest batter of his generation, publicly admitted that McGrath was the most difficult bowler he had ever faced. And you know what? The historical data absolutely backs up that claim. McGrath dismissed Tendulkar 13 times in international cricket. He also dismissed the West Indian genius Brian Lara 15 times. Think about the infamous 1999 Adelaide Test, where McGrath trapped Tendulkar LBW while he was ducking a bouncer. Or the 2003 World Cup final, where he dismissed Tendulkar early to totally set the tone for the match. His torture technique wasn't just effective for cleaning up lower-order tailenders, it successfully and repeatedly neutralized the absolute titans of the sport.
Which brings us to Section 5, Legacy, Tragedy, and Controversy. The complex man off the pitch. Because a sports figure's identity is rarely ever confined strictly to the playing field.
The most profound off-field chapter of his life is actually tied to deep personal tragedy and a truly remarkable philanthropic response. Back in 1997, his first wife, Jane McGrath, was diagnosed with breast cancer. Facing this immense challenge together, they decided they wanted to make a difference, and in 2002, they founded the McGrath Foundation. The primary goal was to fund specially trained breast care nurses in communities right across Australia. Tragically, Jane passed away in 2008, but Glenn took on the role of chairman to continue her vital work. Today, the foundation has funded well over 100 nurses and supported tens of thousands of families going through their darkest hours. And this initiative also birthed the visually spectacular and highly emotional Pink Test in Sydney. Every year, Day 3 of the Sydney Test match transforms the historic stadium into this vibrant sea of pink in Jane's honor, creating a truly beautiful and enduring charitable legacy.
However, delving into his post-cricket life also requires looking at the controversies that have shaped his public profile as well. In 2015, photographs surfaced online showing McGrath at a hunting safari in South Africa. The images showed him posed with various hunted animals, including a buffalo and 2 hyenas. Now, the emergence of these photos sparked immediate and very widespread public criticism, with significant backlash from wildlife conservation advocates, fans, and the general public. In response to the intense outcry, McGrath issued a public statement expressing his deep regret regarding his involvement in the incident. It remains a highly publicized and heavily discussed chapter of his life, showcasing the complex and sometimes turbulent reality of life in the public eye after a celebrated sporting career. All right, let's wrap this up with Section 6, 5 Pillars of Pigeon. Summarizing the legend. Let's pull all these historical threads together to solidify exactly who this man is.
Let's quickly run through these 5 essential takeaways from our exploration today. Number 1, he proved once and for all that unmatched, relentless accuracy will always triumph over raw, express pace. Number 2, he was an absolute master of mental warfare, utilizing his corridor of uncertainty torture technique to systematically break batters' wills. Number 3, he remains a statistical titan of the game, taking a massive 563 test wickets at an astonishing average. Number 4, he was the ultimate clutch performer when the lights were brightest, driving his nation to 3 consecutive World Cup titles. And finally, number 5, he leaves behind a deeply layered and complex off-field legacy defined by immense charitable good and vital community support in the face of deep personal tragedy alongside notable public controversy.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought to ponder. When you look at the entirety of the career of Glenn McGrath and how he basically dismantled the greatest batters the world has ever seen without bowling at the speed of light, it really forces you to ask a fundamental question. Does true greatness in sports actually come from raw physical dominance, or does it ultimately come from the relentless metronomic mastery of the mind? It's a fascinating debate about the very nature of elite athletic performance, isn't it? Think about that next time you watch a game of cricket. Thank you so much for exploring this topic and learning with me today, and I really hope this explainer gave you a deep, structured view into the fascinating paradox of the great Glenn McGrath. Catch you next time!